under one umbrella and then applies engineering principles to it. That's the general concept delineated by the name. What is SecOps engineering? Well, let's take our security, let's take our application development, and let's take whatever the normal business operations are and integrate them, fuse them, have them working together. Now, this has many benefits that we'll see in just a few moments. But again, the idea is to break down those silos between these three groups and have them working together in concert. Now, there are some principles of SecOps engineering, and here are a few of the basic ones. Improvement. You have to be focused on two things. First of all, improving security throughout the organization. You're only as secure as your weakest link, so we have to have security being focused on and improved everywhere. But secondly, it's continuous improvement. You're never good enough. Essentially, you have two choices. Choice number one, you can believe that you are absolutely perfect, your security is infallible. Or choice number two, you have to believe there's room for improvement. And I think you understand that choice number one is just not realistic. That's a fantasy. So we really want to work on continuous improvement. Collaboration is essential. As the name SecOps itself indicates, we want to have cross-team involvement in security. Basically, there's a problem that exists in some organizations today. You have web developers who work in one group. You have operational people that work in another. You have security people that work in another, and their knowledge is not being cross-pollinated. The security people are well aware of issues that perhaps the web developers don't know. This is one reason why the Open Web Application Security Project, OWASP, continually has the same items on the top 10 list year after year, because these are well known to security, not well known to other business units. The only way to fix that problem is collaboration, cross-team involvement. Productivity. Now, we're focused so far on improvement to security, but this will also improve productivity. How? Well, let's use just one example. Let's say your organization is developing an in-house application. Wouldn't it be a good idea, just from a pure productivity point of view, to integrate the operational stakeholders from day one of conceptualization and design, requirements gathering, everything, have them deeply involved? In fact, that's a big part of things like agile programming. But we're also concerned about security, so let's get those people involved from day one as well. That way, we don't finish developing an application and then discover that it either A, doesn't meet stakeholder expectations, or B, doesn't meet security requirements. If that happens, we have to go back, alter things, change things, maybe redo work. That's the antithesis of productivity. So collaboration from the very earliest stages will not only improve security, it's going to improve your productivity as well. Analysis is an important part of SecOps engineering. In fact, it's an important concept of engineering. Now, analysis needs to be done as early as possible. First, let's point out what we mean by analysis. This isn't just informal guessing. We use tools, we use numbers, we quantify issues. Let's take again the example of developing an in-house app. An early analysis would quantify security risks to that app before you start writing code. That way you can come up with mitigating steps before you even start writing code. That's just one example, but I think you get the idea that integrating analysis early and throughout is going to improve performance and security. Threats. You can't defend against what you don't know about. Threat intelligence and awareness are a cornerstone of SecOps engineering. What we mean is this: being aware of trends, upcoming threats, issues that are occurring in the industry or the world as a whole. We don't wait until we're hit with something to decide that, oh, we should address it. We address it as early as possible. And that's a really important concept. And finally, culture. No matter what else you do, if you don't have a security-focused culture, your other security processes, procedures, and activities will be far less effective, and in some cases, completely ineffective. And a culture starts from the top-level executives. So the people at the top have to infuse the organization with the secure steps, which we'll review in this video. But keep in mind that before we talk about policies, app development, things like that, it's important to have a security-hardened infrastructure. So there's some basic things that we have involved in this infrastructure hardening. First of all, network segmentation. Networks should be broken down into smaller segments, and this accomplishes a few goals. One, it's easier to manage traffic and prevent congestion, but secondly, you can apply security to separate networks with separate levels. So for example, if you have a section of your network devoted to research and development, that probably gets much more security measures than your sales group, that sort of thing. It also means that if someone breaches one network segment, they don't automatically have unfettered access to the entire network. Each segment is separated by a router or switch that has firewall capabilities, perhaps intrusion detection, that sort of thing. Operating system hardening, now we'll deal with this in detail in separate videos, but the concept is very simple. We lock down every workstation or server as much as we can. Hardening is what you do before you start adding on things like antivirus. It's removing unneeded services. It's turning off unneeded accounts. It's applying patches, things of that nature. Now, for network infrastructure hardening, you've got to harden every operating system, your workstations, your servers, and even the operating systems on your routers, on your switches, and other devices. Security technology, here's where we start adding in things like intrusion prevention systems, security information event managers or SIEMs, firewalls, antivirus, a robust suite of security technology solutions to mitigate security threats. System updates are critical. It's amazing how often there are major breaches that reach the mainstream media, are known all over the world, for which there were updates that would have prevented them. The one that comes to my mind is 2017's WannaCry virus. It hit a few 100,000 computers in the space of a couple of hours, and it exploited a vulnerability in Microsoft Windows. However, Microsoft had released a patch to that vulnerabilities weeks ahead of time. There was no reason for anyone to be hit with WannaCry. Communications. You have to talk. This goes back to our concept of collaboration. The different teams have to communicate so that everyone is aware. This is particularly important when dispersing cyber threat intelligence information. Everyone has to know if there's a phishing scam going around. It doesn't help if only the security team knows about it, but the actual normal employees don't know and are susceptible to it. When we talk about network segmentation, I mentioned dividing your network up into segments or zones with different security needs and different security measures. This is a critical first step that must happen. It's not enough just to have different segments, but the segments will each be based on security requirements, so there are different levels of security. Virtual LANs or VLANs are a great way to help with segmentation. A VLAN allows you to take a certain number of ports off a switch and treat them as if they're an entirely separate network. Now there's two issues with VLANs. On the one hand, it's a great way to set up network segmentation. On the other hand, you can't allow just anyone to set up a VLAN because a malicious insider could put their machine on a VLAN and then your intrusion detection and prevention systems can't see it. So yes, you need them, but you need to control who sets them up. Secure communications. This means the use of VPNs, transport layer security, digital certificates, all of those things. Now these are just your basic concepts for infrastructure hardening. You need to make sure all of these are applied and very robust and well managed before you start looking into more advanced or exotic forms of cybersecurity. What are some of the essentials? First of all, patches. Ensuring updated patches. Now for home users, it's usually recommended that you have automatic updates turned on. That's not the case for networks because you never know when an update might inadvertently cause a problem with some customized configuration on the network, a server you have, individual software that was custom developed, things of that nature. So what's normally done is you apply the latest patch to a machine or even a virtual machine that has the same configuration, same software, all the same parameters as your actual machines. Then you give it just a little while to see if that update causes any problem for any of your current configurations or software. If it doesn't, you then push it out to the rest of the network. And even then you roll it out in stages in case there is some issue that still causes a problem that you didn't see. Now that doesn't mean that it takes 2 months to roll out a patch. That shouldn't occur. If a patch is released today, you should be able to fully test it within 24 to 72 hours and then begin a gradual rollout. But you must ensure that patches are applied. And that includes routers and switches. They have operating systems that must be patched. Services. Bottom line is if you don't need it, turn it off. If you've got a Windows machine and you don't use remote desktop, turn it off. If you don't use remote access of any type, turn it off. Anything you don't use, turn it off. And because you've turned it off, it can't possibly be exploited. Software. Uninstall unneeded software. I've never quite understood why people leave unnecessary software on machines, particularly servers. If I have a server and all I'm doing on it is web server, then anything not related to that I'm going to uninstall. But the same thing is true for your workstation. If you have a Windows 10 computer, for example, if there's software that comes with Windows that you don't use, uninstall it. If it's not installed on your machine, then you can't possibly have a breach based on some vulnerability in that software because you're not using the software. Now some other issues come up. Always use the operating system's firewall if it has one, and pretty much all of them do. Turn it on, but also properly configure it. Simply turning it on with all default settings is not sufficient. And you may think, well, I have firewalls at the network perimeter. I have firewalls at the various routers and switches that lead to segmentation. Do I really need a firewall on individual machines? Yes. And why wouldn't you when it's there part of the operating system for free? User accounts. I'll use Windows as an example, but the concept applies to any operating system. I bet you never ever log in to your home computer with the guest account. But there is a guest account. Why don't you disable it? These are some simple concepts. If you don't need a user account, turn it off. In a network situation, any user who's left the organization, their account should be immediately disabled. And that's all accounts, network accounts, local machine accounts, whatever. Turn them off. Remember basic security principles like least privileges. Every user or service on that operating system gets just enough privileges to do their job. Now let's return to Windows as an example. If you have a Windows computer at home, and you usually simply surf the internet with an account that has administrative privileges, that's violating the least privileges concept. You don't need administrative privileges to Google something, do you? And if you happen to get malware while you're logged in as administrator, that malware operates with administrative privileges. Why don't you create a second account that has far less privileges, log in with that account to do basic stuff, and then if you need administrative rights, you can always right-click and choose Run as Administrator. So those fundamental security concepts, least privileges, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, those things have to be applied to individual operating systems as well as the entire network. Secure browsing. It is still the case that a lot of malware happens through your browser. Lots of things you can do to make that more secure. You can look at the individual settings in your browser, whether it's Edge or Firefox or Chrome or Safari, it doesn't matter. Use the most secure settings that you're comfortable with. Now you can lock it down so much that it's hard to surf the internet. Also part of secure browsing is simply education. Going to random new links you don't know about is a great way to get to a malicious website. Downloading anything you're not 100% sure of is a great way to get malware in your system. So secure browsing is both a matter of configuring the browser and of educating the users. Now these are some fundamental principles involved in operating system hardening. In later videos I'll show you specifically how to harden both Windows 10 and Windows Server 2019. Cyber threat intelligence is critical. You have to be aware of what's going on out in the world, in your industry, and in your region before it hits your organization. Fortunately, there are a lot of free web resources that will help you do this. Right here, I'm highlighting the URL. We're looking at the National Institute of Standards National Vulnerability Database. Now, it also has a feed that you can subscribe to. It lists the latest 20 scored vulnerabilities with summaries and severity, so you can see precisely what's out there right now. You can also use this website to search for vulnerabilities. You can get vulnerability metrics and recommended products from the National Institute of Standards. Now, this is just one resource. There are several others we're going to look at. Next, we're going to look at the Computer Emergency Response Team, or CERT, their alert page. This will give you current alerts that they've put out. And any one of these you can click on and get all the details, the release date, what systems are affected, technical details, and mitigating steps. So this is a great resource that any security engineer should be looking at on a regular basis. Now, another resource you might find interesting is the Alien Vault website. This website is an exchange site for threat intelligence. You can sign up for it. It doesn't cost you anything, and it allows you to receive intel from other people and to submit intelligence. Gain free access to over 19 million threat indicators contributed daily. So that's very, very important for you. Yet another free website is ThreatCrowd. Now, this is a search engine. If you've received an email, for example, and you'd like to know if it's associated with threats, I'll put mine in there, and it will do a search to see if that's ever been reported related to a phishing scheme, a threat, a scam, anything of that nature. So you go through and there's absolutely nothing connected to that email. So it hasn't been related to any threats. Good to know. But this is a great place when you get suspicious emails, suspicious websites, whatever. You can run them through ThreatCrowd and find out. The SANS Institute also gives you a very nice resource. Let's go to that site. It's their Internet Storm Center from SANS. Here we see it loaded, giving you the latest exploits, what is coming out right now, and a lot of detail. This is another place, like NIST and CERT, that any cybersecurity engineer should be visiting on a fairly regular basis. Now, if phishing is your concern, we have a few websites here. Openfish.com. This gives you accurate, relevant threat intelligence regarding phishing, and there are some specific URLs going around right now with the specific targets. So this is a great way to keep up with what's happening in phishing. We have another similar site called fishtank.com. This is a great source to get in the most recent phishing scams, who submitted them, the ID, find out all you'd like, and if you suspect a website, let's put mine in there, we can check and see if that's a phishing site. No response to it. So, those are phishing sites. Now let me give you the most important now. Shodan. Shodan is a search engine that allows you to search all kinds of vulnerabilities. I'm going to show you this in just a moment. Let me start with something simple. Default password. What machines, public-facing machines that have a public IP address, are using default password? Well, this should disturb you. There are over 46,000 worldwide, over 7,000 in the US. But perhaps you're only interested in those in a specific domain. So we will say host name, my domain. Does my domain have any public-facing IP addresses with default username and password? It doesn't. It'd be great to run your own domain through this. And you can search for default password, outdated versions of Apache or IIS, unsecured webcams, any number of things. And the good news, if you're not comfortable with Shodan, is first of all, it's free. You sign up for a free account. I've had one for over 10 years and never received a single spam email, so don't worry about that. The second issue is, if you need to learn it, simply Googling Shodan tutorial. There's tons of them that will show you all the various commands you can use. Now, these are some basic resources to get you started with bringing cyber threat intelligence into your security operations, your SecOps engineering. Firewalls are one of the most fundamental, and normally you're going to be using at a minimum a stateful packet inspection or SPI firewall. Most firewalls today are SPI. You should have one at your perimeter, one at each network segment where routers or switches join network segments, and one on each workstation or server. You also should consider things like a web application firewall in front of your web server. And there are other application firewalls, such as a database application firewall. Firewalls are only one part of your security posture, but they're an important part that has to be included. Intrusion detection systems and intrusion prevention systems. An IDS detects activity that appears to be a possible intrusion, logs it, and notifies the administrator. The IPS takes the additional step of shutting down the suspicious activity. Now, it's not a question of which one is right, which one is wrong. Depends on your scenario, because there's always the possibility of false positives. In other words, an IPS might inadvertently shut down communication that it thought was malicious that was in fact legitimate. I recommend you look at different security postures for different network segments. High secure segments may require an IPS. Less secure segments may go with an IDS. And then of course you can choose between host-based and network-based. But literally every major network segment, if not every network segment, should be covered with an IDS or IPS. And then all of your servers should have their own host-based IDS or IPS. Honeypots. A honeypot is a fake system that appears to be legitimate, and it accomplishes two goals. Goal number one is an attacker that's scanning the network, sees this system, thinks it's real, thinks that's where all the important data is, they jump on it, and they're so focused on it they're not going after the real systems. The second advantage of a honeypot is no one ever really goes to it. It's not used for anything. Therefore, it can be configured with an absolutely ridiculous amount of logging, tracing, tracking to gather evidence on whoever did connect to it. Now, honeypots are a very valuable piece of equipment. Most organizations have firewall and antivirus, many have IDS and IPS, but all too few have honeypots, and at least putting one into your DMZ where your web server and other devices are is highly recommended. Security information event monitoring. Basically, this thing does two goals. Number one, it aggregates all of your logs, the logs from your firewalls, your servers, your routers. It's impossible to go around and check every log on every device, so let's bring them all to one place. But a good SIEM also does analysis of the data and alerts, so this can be a valuable piece of your security posture. And of course, anti-malware. Selecting the appropriate one, deploying it, and keeping it updated. There should be antivirus for the network segments as well as individual machines. Now, I can't endorse a particular antivirus manufacturer, but I do recommend you carefully review and compare them. Don't just grab the one whose name you're most familiar with or you used at your last job. These are basic security devices that must be in place in your organization to even begin having a secure. You can select the appropriate device for your network. First of all, they can be broken down into deployment. Network deployments are deployments which will monitor a particular network segment. And you can have a network intrusion detection device or network intrusion prevention device called a NIDS or NIPS, so Network Intrusion Detection System or Network Intrusion Prevention System. Or you can deploy them on a single machine, and then the name is Host Intrusion Detection System or Host Intrusion Prevention System, HIDS or HIPS. Now in reality, there's usually a combination. For example, your network segments should have some sort of protection, NIDS or NIPS. And then specific sensitive servers should also have host-based systems. So for example, a web server in your demilitarized zone, your DMZ, should probably have its own host-based system. Now that's one way to look at these devices, their deployment. whether it's network or host. Then we can look at how they behave. The active is what we now call an intrusion prevention system. Whether it's network or host based, it's still active. What that means is, if it detects a possible threat, some activity that registers either as a signature attack or anomalous behavior that might be an attack, an intrusion prevention system will not only notify the administrator and log the event, but will shut down the traffic. Now, the alternative is passive or intrusion detection. In those systems, the network administrator is notified, the event details are logged, but the possible attack traffic is not shut down. Now, you might immediately assume that active is the only way to go. Don't you want to shut down the traffic? Well, the issue is very simple. There is such a thing as false positives. What if the system believes something is an attack and it's not really an attack, and it inadvertently shuts down legitimate traffic? Now, in some scenarios, that is something you're willing to accept. In others, it's not. So you have to look at the sensitivity of either the host or the network segment to decide whether intrusion prevention or intrusion detection is appropriate. My real recommendation that I normally give people is a mixture. Your most sensitive servers, your most sensitive network segments should have intrusion prevention. Less sensitive areas, intrusion detection would be totally appropriate. Now, the way they work is a combination of signature and heuristics, much like antivirus. They have attack signatures that tell them this is definitely attack. But then they look at behavior, network traffic, and they compare it to some rules that are configured for them, and they see if that behavior appears to be illegitimate. For example, a sudden dramatic spike in network bandwidth could be a distributed denial of service. It could be a large exfiltration of data. Of course, it could also be an anomalous high amount of legitimate traffic. That's where we get back to the possibility of false positives. Now, placement issues. You need to understand that intrusion detection and prevention systems can only see their local network segment. What that means is you either have one on every network segment, or you have traffic forwarded to where the IDS IPS is through something like port mirroring, or you put sensors in each network segment and they forward the traffic to a single IDS IPS. Either way, these usually cannot see beyond their own network segment. Keep that in mind when you're deploying. It's also a really good idea to put one in the DMZ. That's going to be your first line of warning regarding an external attack. Now again, you'll have to decide whether you want intrusion prevention or detection. In the DMZ, it's really a difficult decision because you're more likely to get anomalous traffic. Let's say you have an e-commerce site and you have a sudden big sale and traffic quadruples. Is that an attempted denial of service? Or is this what you wanted, the outcome of a really good sale, increased traffic? You certainly would not want to shut down legitimate sales traffic to your e-commerce site. That defeats the whole purpose of having an e-commerce site. So there will be a little bit of work on figuring out whether to use intrusion prevention or detection in the DMZ, but one or the other should certainly be there. And of course, we mentioned previously, critical servers should have their own host-based IDS or IPS. Again, you'll have to decide which is more important. The fact that they're critical servers makes one lean towards intrusion prevention systems. But either way, something to specifically monitor that host. Just like individual hosts have their own antivirus and firewalls, they should also have their own IDS or IPS, at least for the critical servers. Now, there's a lot of IDSs and IPS solutions out there, both commercial and open source, but all of them have some common components. First of all, there'll be a sensor. This is software that simply collects traffic. Basically, it's a packet sniffer, much like TCP dump or Wireshark. It's just collecting packets. That's all it's doing. Gets a copy of the traffic. That's the first step in analyzing traffic. And the next step is an analyzer. Now, this is where the real issues come in to which IDS or IPS you really want. The rules are what analyze that traffic. So you want a product that will give you a nice pre-configured set of rules for all the common things and then allow you to build your own rules. And frankly, that's where the real artistry comes in managing IDS and IPS, getting the rules just right. The odds that you'll have them exactly right immediately out of the box are very, very remote. There's a bit of an art to figuring out the appropriate rules to minimize false positives without allowing actual attacks to go through. Manager. Now this isn't the human, this is the manager interface. For an open source product like Snort, that's just a command line window. Other commercial products have a nice GUI where you get to interact. Oddly enough, picking the right manager can be part of picking the right tool. Do you need a rich GUI interface, or are you fine with command line? If you're going for a GUI interface, what are the features you specifically want? These are things to look at when selecting an IDS or IPS. Events. That is anything that the IDS or IPS rules have determined is interesting, something you should look at. Now, that doesn't absolutely mean it is an attack. It means it could be. One good example would be an internal employee suddenly establishes a TLS connection to an outside IP address, and that is not normal for either that employee or that IP address. That could be data exfiltration. Of course, it could also be normal traffic that just hasn't happened before. It could be legitimate. So looking at an event does not necessarily mean you have an attack. It means you have something that requires a little bit of analysis to determine what's happening. Now again, these are the components in any IDS or IPS, whether it's open source, whether it's command line, commercial, GUI, whatever it may be. So hopefully now you have a good understanding of IDS and IPS. And whichever particular solution you choose, it's a good idea to have ITS and IBS integrated in your security devices. Make sure that's part of your security defense strategy, just like firewall and just like antivirus. Concerned with database activities, this gives you a little more latitude in turning off unneeded services and removing unneeded software because you have a limited purpose for the system, so there's more you can remove. Other than that, it's quite similar. Some fundamentals. First of all, the standard operating system hardening principles that apply to any operating system. Shutting down any unneeded ports or services. And as we just stated, this may be a little more permissive in the server environment. Making sure the system is updated. This is at least as important for a server as it is for any other computer. And finally, uninstalling any unneeded applications. Now you might think, what harm does it have to have an application on the server if I'm not even using it? Well, what if that application later is found to have a vulnerability? Well, if you don't have the application on the server, then you're not concerned about those vulnerabilities. Next, looking at the needed services. By hardening them, what I'm talking about is ensuring that their authentication methods are robust, that they're running with least privileges, that they have a good, strong authentication and login system, that the services you require, the web service or the database service, are as strong as they can be. Routinely checking for vulnerabilities. Now, certainly one can do this on any system, but it's even more important for a server. Some sort of vulnerability scanning system, managing vulnerabilities when they're found, so you document them, prioritize them, and then address them. Now these basic principles will apply to a Linux server, Windows server, any server at all. This is how you go about hardening the servers. And a fundamental part of security on any network is that the individual servers, and indeed all the systems, are hardened. So apply these fundamental concepts to your network and you will get a substantial improvement to security immediately. I think we're all aware at this point of the number of major breaches that have occurred due to failure to update, unneeded services running with vulnerabilities, or failure to be aware of and manage vulnerabilities. These principles right here would eliminate quite a few of the major breaches you've read about in the news. So certainly make this a part. It's available, of course, the Macintosh, Linux, and Windows. But Windows is ubiquitous, particularly in a business environment. Windows workstations are the norm. So being able to harden a Windows system is vital. Now, fortunately, almost everything we need to do can be done right here in the control panel, and I'm going to walk you through specifically what we need to do. First thing is, we'll look under Programs. Now, oftentimes people don't think about this, but turning Windows features on and off. If there's a feature you're not using, turn it off. It's very simple. If you're not using some remote access feature, and I'll scroll down here just a little bit to look at some common ones. If you're not using PowerShell, then turn it off. Now, you may want PowerShell. I certainly like it, but there are certainly a lot of PowerShell attacks. So if you don't need it, turn it off. If you're not using Telnet, take it off. And that I definitely think you should take off. And we go through all of these. Now, you may need a feature. I'm not suggesting you take off something you need. I'm suggesting you go through this list and anything unneeded gets taken out. That's the first. And you do a similar thing with uninstalling any installed programs. So let's go back to the Control Panel Home. Let's look at System and Security. And under Administrative Tools, you're going to find a lot of interesting things here. I'm going to start by looking at Services. Let's give that a moment to open up. Now, services may be the easiest thing to analyze. You see them all here, and then you can sort them by running or not running, how they start up. But I'm going to use name sorting, and I'm going to come right down here to one that often gets overlooked. Remote Desktop Services. Now, as soon as I click on it, it tells me what it does. So you can immediately decide, do I want this or not? Now, if I open it up, I get more information like dependencies. Are there other things that will fail if I turn this off? So be careful, and if A, you think you might use it, don't turn it off. If B, there are other services you do need that are dependent, don't turn it off. But if you don't need it, turn it off. So it's very easy. Microsoft will tell you exactly what the service does, and again, under dependencies, you'll find out what else depends on that. So you'll know whether or not you want to turn it off. Now here's one right now I would probably turn off on a real system. Moving right along, that's services. We can also look at system configuration, and we'll see some interesting things there. The most interesting part is what things happen at startup. Now in Windows 10 it started doing this through the task manager, but it takes us right there, so we'll take a look at that. Are there any things that are at startup that shouldn't be? Frankly, spyware often gets stuck in here, so you'd want to turn that off, but anything that you don't think should be at startup, take it out. To be honest, it seems like every programmer today wants their software to be at startup, so that's a great place to look for some things to cut loose. We're going to cancel that. Now you also will want to look at computer management. Now this is for individual hosts, remember. A lot of people are not aware of some of the rules you can set right here. Now I'm going to look under Local, Users, and Groups. Do I use a guest account? If not, perhaps I should disable it? Things like that. Now this is a test machine, you can tell by the names of my accounts, but if you don't need an account, turn it off. You also get a chance to look at what tasks are scheduled. Do you want to unschedule them? You get a chance to look at your Windows logs, make sure they're turned on. All of these are things that you can do to harden your system. Now you can also view your events here, and my favorite that gets overlooked too often is the local security policy. Most people think about domain policies and don't think about local policies. And look, we have things like password policies here, where you can enforce password history, minimum age, minimum password length. 0 characters is probably bad. Complexity, yes, we want that. No, we don't want to store encrypted. We want to store as a hash. Lockout policies. How long will it lock out? 0 means it will never lock out. So these are default settings. Now I'm showing you this, and you may wonder, why am I showing you such bad security settings? I say again, these are the default. So if you've never set these, this is what your system has right now. So basically, turning off unneeded services, shutting down anything you don't need, looking at local security policy, all of these will go a long way to hardening your Windows 10 computer. Let's talk about server hardening. Now what you're looking at now is the new Windows Server 2019. Now, if you're still using 2016, frankly, much of this is still going to apply. In fact, this dashboard probably looks like the ones you've seen in the past. Now, one of the things that's different between this and the workstation like Windows 10 is where you go to add and remove features. Right here is adding roles and features, adding other servers. So you'll want to make sure that there are no roles that you don't need. So we'll take a look at what roles are already here. And as we go forward, we see the machine we're talking about. And you can see all the roles that are currently defined for this machine. Now, obviously, a server was set up to serve some purpose, so you need some roles, of course. But if there's any role here that you don't need, take it out. That's the first part of hardening. And a similar thing with features. If there's any features here you don't need, take them out. And we can always think of some. For example, if this is only connected hardwired, take out the wireless if you're not going to use it. On the other hand, there are some here that are not on by default, like BitLocker drive encryption, that you might very much want to turn on. Group policy management, you might very much want to turn on. Now, that's normally done from a domain controller, but you might need it. So definitely spend some time looking at these screens. I'm going to close all this out for a moment. Now, the desktop looks pretty much like Windows 10. No real difference there. So I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to look under Start and see what sorts of things we have. Well, you'll notice immediately we have Windows Security, which is the Windows Firewall, and similar items in there. So you can go through here, turn on virus protection with Bitdefender, configure the firewall, app and browser control. Now, it's telling you here these are all checked, so you might think just ignore them. Well, I would advise you go in there and take a look at what they're doing and make sure that what they consider appropriate matches what you think's appropriate. Another thing we'll look at, let's scroll on down here again to Start. You can see the administrative tools, which again will take you back to some of the same things we saw in Windows 10, including services. And you'll want to take a look at that just like you did for Windows 10 and see if there's anything you don't need. Sometimes there are default things that we just don't want turned on. Now, this is a server. I probably don't want someone to do remote desktop configuration or remote desktop services. You might notice that in Windows 10 these were turned on by default, and the server they're turned off by default. That's normal. The Windows Server versions are generally more secure and more locked down than the client version. So this gives you at least a good start towards hardening. Some of this is already done for you. But still check it. Don't just assume that they made all the decisions that you would make. And again, we'll go back down to Start. And again, under Administrative Tools, you have all kinds of things in here, such as the Event Viewer. Make sure that logging is turned on. You have the Microsoft Azure services for cloud security. A lot of people ignore local security policy on a server, assuming it's being covered by domain policies. And that may work, but I would go ahead and take a look at it anyway. And of course, under Settings, we have all the things you would have in Windows 10, where you can look at network and internet settings, app settings. This is another way to go, by the way, to uninstall if you wish. We also have ease of access accounts. Now, this is a place we looked at when we talked about Windows 10, but let's look at Windows Server. This doesn't have a guest account by default, which is good, but double check and see if you have one and you want to disable it. So essentially, Windows Server 2019 is not that different than Windows 10, except it comes already, a lot of the configuration settings are proper, so you'll have a little less to do, but still check them out and make sure you're hardening your server. First of all, there are stateless firewalls. These were often simply called simple packet filtering firewalls. What they do is a packet comes in, and the firewall compares the packet to a set of rules. Perhaps it has rules like, is this packet coming on a port that we allow traffic on? Is it using a protocol that we allow? And is it coming from an IP address that we haven't blocked? Now, that's a simple example of rules, but that gets the idea. Now you might think that's exactly what I want a firewall to do, and for many years that was correct. There's a problem. Imagine that you have a firewall in front of your web server. Well, you certainly allow people to connect to the web server, don't you? That's why you have it. Well, then you would expect to see packets coming in that have the SYN, SYN, or synchronized flag turned on. That's normal traffic. So your firewall rules will allow that. Well, attackers exploit that and they send a flood, thousands and thousands of these SYN packets, never completing the three-way handshake, and that's an old denial of service attack called a SYN flood. A simple packet filtering or stateless firewall will never prevent that. So what's the answer? Well, fortunately, most firewalls today are stateful. Stateful packet inspection, often abbreviated SPI. Now, the goal of this is that when you connect through the firewall, you have to first establish a connection with it, and the firewall maintains data on the state of this communication. Now, that's the purpose. That's how they're designed, but the side effect is the stateful packet inspection SPI firewall is aware of all of the previous communication from a particular IP address that's connected to it. So SYN floods no longer work with SPI firewalls. Yes, the firewall will allow a single packet with the SYN flag turned on to come through. But when it sees 1,000 in a space of 10 seconds, it becomes aware that that's not legitimate traffic and will shut it down. Now, it may or may not require 1,000. That's just an example. The bottom line is today there is absolutely no reason for you to use any firewall that is not stateful. SPI or stateful packet inspection is what you should always be using. Now beyond that, we can enhance firewalls, such as application firewalls. They normally have the stateful activities, that stateful packet inspection, but they add to it specific protections at the application layer for some specific application. The classic example is a web application firewall, or WAF. It will do SPI, but it will also check for SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and other common web attacks. Now, frankly, any public-facing server should absolutely have an application firewall between it and the public. There is really no room for an exception on that. If you're running a web server, you must have a web application firewall. That's fundamental. Now, where should you put firewalls? Obviously at the perimeter. I think everyone puts one at the perimeter. A good stateful packet inspection firewall at any gateways into your network, that is a common thing that I think most security people do. If you have network segments, well, they're normally segmented by routers and switches. Routers and switches almost always have their own built-in firewall, so why not turn it on? Why not add that extra layer of protection at your network segments? Then, of course, individual hosts. Today, every computer comes with a firewall. Your Windows client has a firewall. Why not turn it on? Why not configure it? Let's have that extra layer of protection. And of course, in the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, particularly if you have a web server out there, you'll need a web application firewall. Now, it's not our goal in this particular video to endorse a particular firewall product, but if you think about proper placement, you ensure you're using SPI firewalls throughout and web application firewalls where needed, then the only other issue is your firewall rules. This requires a little effort. You have to ensure that you've thought this through and that you've got the appropriate rules for what to allow and what to disallow. And most firewalls today will also allow you to fine-tune that even further. You'll have different rules for authenticated communication versus unauthenticated, for rules within the domain versus traffic coming from outside the domain. You can really fine-tune these. If I were to point to one thing that is the biggest firewall mistake I see in the real world, is people just go with a default set of rules and they don't give enough thought and planning to the rules they select, and then they don't revisit those to see if they need to be modified. So firewall rule development is going to be a big part of appropriate use of a firewall. How they can be used. We want to fix that in this video because I think you'll see when we're done that this could be a very valuable addition to your security. Let's start with what are they? They're fake systems. They look like real systems. Perhaps it's a server that appears to have real financial data on it, but it's all fake data. You could set up any system you want. It simply has to appear to be a real system, but none of the data on it is real. Why would you do this? When someone breaches your network, let's say an external attacker, they're looking for valuable data. They see a server that appears to have thousands of customer records, complete with account numbers, logins, credit card numbers. They believe they have hit pay dirt. Now, two things occur. The first is they think they found what they're looking for. They will focus on exfiltrating that data rather than looking for your real systems. The next thing that happens, the next benefit, is because this isn't a real system, no one ever really legitimately connects to it. So you can set it up with an absurd amount of monitoring, tracing, even have it notify an administrator the moment someone connects, try to trace back the traffic, basically collect evidence on the attack. And it can collect a tremendous amount of evidence because there's no real users that ever access it. The moment someone touches it, you know that they have malicious intent. So we've covered what they are, why you use them, and I really have to emphasize that I think almost any network of any significance could benefit from a honeypot. Now how? How do you set this up? Well, you can get commercial solutions. There's a ton of them out there that are fake systems, and they're easily configured. Some of them even have a GUI. You just install it on a machine, go through, set the settings, and boom, you have a fake honeypot. Some will even appear to be an entire network segment. So those are great solutions. If you don't want to do that, take an old machine, perhaps one you're decommissioning because it's no longer quite good enough for your needs. Make sure you remove all real data on it. You can even use a summer intern for this process. Put on a database perhaps, or file system with specific sensitive looking files. But if you're using a database, enter fake data. Now there's a couple of rules. The data has to look real. You can't name the customer accounts Clark Kent and Barney Rubble. They have to appear to be real. And secondly, the security of the system has to be just slightly less than your real system. It can't be absurdly unsecure. Totally unpatched system with a password of password. Frankly, any attacker that's at all good at what he does will realize that's not legit and will not go to your honeypot. So those are some rules on how to do it. Now, everyone thinks a lot about the external attacker. So you'll see a lot of honeypots when they are deployed in the DMZ, and that's a great idea. I have no objection to that, and that is the first thing that comes to mind. But unfortunately today we cannot ignore the internal threat. So placing a server on your internal network that appears to have sensitive documents or data could reveal some internal threat who's attempting to exfiltrate confidential data, either for malicious intent to sell, maybe just to discredit some part of the organization, or simply out of curiosity. Now, most people who think honeypot think external. I'd like you to consider internal just as well. This is a general overview of honeypots. I hope that you'll consider integrating honeypots into the security posture of your network. Welcome to the course summary. In this course, we talked about a lot of exciting things. We discussed system infrastructure security in some detail. We gave you general security concepts that are applicable across a wide range of different scenarios. We talked about hardening, both host and server. We looked at intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems. We explored firewalls in a little bit of depth. And we introduced you to honeypots. All of these are fundamental things that will make your network far more secure. Securing your infrastructure is critical to having a secure system. Now, coming up next, secure coding, which is another integral part of